Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that a couple of years ago, I was working with street children in Chad, in the south of Chad, and seeing my children dying every day from malaria, I thought at this time, who will have the kind of words you just had now, Jeff? So I'm very, very happy to be able to listen to these words here, because now working as the chief economist of the French Development Agency, which is the French analog of USAID, when I go to the World Bank, I see a number of people very nice and smart like Professor Ferrero, but I don't listen so often to this kind of words. So thank you for what you just said. The topic of my talk is quite simple in a sense. It's to say that there is a strong link between climate and poverty. In a sense, this is a message of Laudato Si. Since integral ecology means that we should not try to fight against climate change on the one hand, and not bearing in mind that climate change has a huge impact on the poor. So you can see this on this map where I use the climate change vulnerability index, which is a kind of measure of the exposure of people towards climate change, physical climate change, that is the rise of the sea level, etc., etc. And as you see, the more blue you are, the more exposed you are. So, as you know, there is a kind of double punishment in the sense that those countries which are not polluting or whose emissions are negligible in comparison with, let's say, the US, Europe, and China, and Japan, are also those countries which are the poorest and also those countries which are most exposed to climate change. In addition to that, if you look now at the adaptation capability, that is, in a sense, the fragility of the states and its ability to change and to adapt to climate change, again, there is a kind of third punishment, because again, you find the same countries which are the less capable to adapt to climate change. And climate change adaptation is certainly not a very easy task. Let me just mention one example. I was in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago, and in Vietnam, all the coast between Da Nang and Hoi An is now destroyed by the rise of the sea level. This is a huge concern for the Vietnamese government. And at first they thought, oh, we should build some dikes, to protect the coast, as we did during centuries in the Netherlands. But then French engineers came and realized that the rise of the sea level might change the direction of waves and streams of water. So you may build dikes today that will be efficient today, but that will lead to a disaster in 20 years, because meanwhile, the waves will have changed the directions. So adaptation to climate change means adaptation to an ever-changing process, which makes the whole task very difficult. Now, there is a report by the World Bank, written by one of my friends, Stefan Algat, and other people, who makes these links between climate change and poverty, and who, in a sense, is claiming that if we don't fight against climate change, having the poor in mind, we may end up with very bad situations in a couple of years, if not decades. So the phenomena, them are very easy. First of all, you may have price shocks linked to lower agricultural production. You may have also, of course, natural disasters. You may have health shocks. And also you may have the fact that due to climate change, people may reduce investments and asset accumulation, which will cause more poverty in the future. Now, more precisely, these graphs gives a hint towards the link between climate change and poverty. So the left picture deals with sub-Saharan Africa, and the right picture with South Asia. The green line, is the evolution of the quantity of food that will be presumably available to poor people in this region as a proportion of the quantity of food that is available today in developed countries. So as you see, you start with a very low level at the beginning of this century, less than 70%. And if everything goes well, and if there was no climate change, you would have quite a sharp increase of the quantity of food available to people. But now, depending upon various scenarios regarding the emissions of greenhouse gas, you may look at the yellow line or the red line, and they both say that because of climate change, it might be the case that most people in these regions would suffer from a huge lack of food and actually might even not make any progress with respect to the quantity of food they have today. Another example is the exposure of people towards floods. So the urban poor are more exposed to river floods in many countries, and as you know, climate change most probably will increase the frequency of these floods. And here you see again the kind of triple and fourth punishment, because again we see that those countries most exposed are also the poorest countries and those countries which emit less greenhouse gas. Now on average, I don't know whether you can read the figures. The most interesting figure is on the right side bottom. It says, roughly speaking, that if we don't do anything, it might be the case, but by 2030, the number of people below the extreme poverty line that was described yesterday by Jeff.
Sorry, this is stop. I want to remind you that don't speak too close to the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Here it's okay?
Yeah.
It's better? Okay. Now, if you look at the right bottom part of the figures, you see 122 million people. It means that according to this report by the World Bank, if we don't do anything, it might be the case, but that by 2030, okay. Is it okay this way?
Yes.
By 2030, you may have something like 122 million people falling below the extreme poverty line by 2030 because of climate change. And the last picture regarding this issue, saying, roughly speaking, that it's not just a matter of climate, but also of biodiversity. So here you have a rough picture of the density in fish, in the haliotic fauna, in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean in 1900, left, and in 2000, right. And as you can see, the Atlantic Ocean is essentially empty today. So, and you may know that a number of experts are claiming that if we don't do anything, we might not have any fish anymore in the oceans between 2040 and 2050. And then this will cause also a huge poverty, because a lot of people are just living thanks to the fish they can get in the oceans. So this is a huge concern, not just for people who like fishes in the oceans, but also for people who are living from them. Now, the second point I want to mention is a number of surveys I run with a friend of mine who is a sister Cécile Renoir, a French sister from the Assumption. What we did is we took the viewpoint that the impact of climate change on poverty is essentially a multidimensional phenomenon. It should be assessed as such, and that we should focus on social networks. Social networks being a central element of human development and dignity. So we decided to construct an index, relational capability index, whose main pillars are the following. The first pillar on the top is integration to networks. So it's a way to assess how well integrated into networks you are. Do you have an employment? Do you have an access to transport? Do you have an access to telecommunication, or cell phone, etc.? Do you get frequently some information through the TV, through radio, etc.? Second dimension, private relations. What is the size of your household? What are the family ties around yourself? How many close friends do you have? What kind of financial support can you get from your friends? And do you trust the community in which you are embedded? Third pillar, civic commitment. Are you engaged in some groups, be it youth groups, religious groups, etc.? Do you engage into collective action? Do you vote? Do you feel the solidarity of people outside of your community? Do you trust other people? Now, if you mix these three pillars, you get the index. And in a sense, this is a measure of the quality of the networks in which people are involved. Now, just one application among many others, we studied the impact of the flood in 2012 in the south of Nigeria, in the Niger Delta. And to put it in a nutshell, I don't have time to go into the details. And if you want, you should have I can give you the paper, which is going to be published. In a nutshell, the outcome of this study is the following. Because of the flood, you had an increase in the internal trust within the community, which is understandable. If you have a big disaster, then people tend to have more solidarity with their neighbors. But you had then less altruism in the sense that you had less trust towards people outside of the community. Then at the same time, just after the disaster, there was a huge development project put into practice by a French oil company called Total. And then it turns out that this external help induced an increase of the altruism with respect to other people outside of the community, which is also obvious. But the main lesson to be drawn from this is that the unequal repartition of help reduced the whole relational capability index. And this is, we got exactly the same conclusion from many studies in Nigeria, in Indonesia, India, Mexico, Brazil. That is, the inequality in the development project or in the help put into practice by people outside of the country, this inequality may destroy the quality of the social networks and have a very bad negative effect on the RCI, namely the Relational Capability Index. So the main lesson to be drawn is that the way external help influences the social network matters in the way we are let's say, putting into practice development projects. Now, if we want to fight against climate change, having in mind poor people as being the first victims of it, as you probably know, I mean, the roadmap is quite well known. I don't go into the details, but as you know, we have to change the energy mix of the world economy, and we have to have green mobility, we have, etc. Now, the main question can be summarized within this very, very simple equation. This is high school algebra. On the left-hand side, you have the quantity of CO2 emitted. On the right-hand side, you have the same quantity, but developed. E is the quantity of energy consumed. PIB is the GDP in French, and POP is the population. So just trust me or remind your high school math, this equation is a tautology. It's always true. Now, if we want to reduce the quantity of CO2, left-hand side, we have to reduce something in the right-hand side. So let's see at what we can reduce. Population. As you know, it will increase in the coming decades, and I don't think we are really able to change the demographic curve. Then GDP over population. This is just income per capita. I don't know any politician who could be elected by saying, I will reduce GDP per capita, even though you may have governments who fail at the elections, even though they have a huge growth, like in Ireland. So there is little hope that we will reduce GDP per capita by design. We may reduce it by disaster, but not by design. Then energy divided by GDP. This is in a sense a measure of the efficiency of energy. And there are a number of reasons for which I don't believe that this will be reduced tremendously in the coming years or decades. It will reduce a little bit, but it will not be divided by 2 or 3 as we need it to reduce, to diminish. Then what remains is CO2 divided by energy. And this is the main variable on which we can work, which essentially boils down to changing the energy mix of the world economy. Now, once we have understood this, I don't have time to go into all this, the question is how much will it cost to do this? To change the energy mix of the world economy, which amounts to 80% of fossil fuels today, into a low-carbon economy in the coming decades. You probably are aware of the New Climate Economy report written under the direction of Nick Stern, which roughly says that we need something like 90 trillions of US dollars in the next 15 years to finance green infrastructures, approximately 2 trillions per year for northern countries and 4 trillions per year in southern countries. Now the question is, if you talk to people, they will tell you, oh yes, that's a huge amount of money, nobody can afford to pay this. Then, in a sense, we could repeat the kind of speech that was just given by Jeff, saying, are you sure we don't have that money? Here you look at the quantity of money basis emitted by the Fed in the US since the crash of 2008. So you have the various quantitative easing policies. And the red curve is the inflation rate. So we now for various reasons, in the details of which I'm not going to enter, and I think because of deflation, we can create a lot of money without having inflation. First, so why not why not tell to the central banks, you could create money to fight against climate, not just to save banks. Why not create money to save the poor instead of creating money to save the banks? Second, here is also the public debt of the US rate curve, which is increasing tremendously, and you have the spread of the public debt of the US on the markets, which is the blue curve. So contrary to what most primitive economic textbooks would tell you, the huge increase of the public debt of the US does not imply that you have an increase of the spread of the public debt of the US. Now countries, again because of deflation, can increase the debt without suffering on markets, at least a number of countries. So the question is, for what do we increase the public debt of big countries like the US, like France, etc.? So this is a summary of the main paradox. We have a huge amount of money printed by central banks. We need 90 trillions, roughly speaking, to finance green infrastructures. And now, if you talk to pension funds, insurance companies, they will tell you, we have a lot of money, but we don't know where to invest it. We are lacking interesting investments. It seems to me this is the main macroeconomic paradox of our day, and we have to change our mind in order to make to turn this paradox into an opportunity, trying to convince insurance companies, pension funds, that they should invest the huge amount of money they have into green infrastructures to fight against climate change, to help poor people in the future. How do you do this? I will just mention one example, which is an example for which the French government is now struggling. It's the idea of having a corridor of prices of carbon. As you know, there is a debate within economists today regarding the question as to whether it's possible to have a worldwide carbon price. And one of my friends and colleagues, Giraud, is claiming that it's easy because you just have to open a huge market and you will get spontaneously one worldwide carbon price. I don't believe this at all, 1 second, because even in Europe, within Europe, we did not succeed in having this market. So who can believe that you will ever find this kind of market at the world scale? So what we convinced the French government to push now is the idea to have a corridor of prices. Not a single price, but a corridor with a cap and a floor. So you would bargain politically with countries, saying, look, it's in the common interest of everybody that we should increase, let's say we should have a carbon tax. So why not having, a floor and a cap, and you should do whatever you want to have your carbon tax within the floor and the cap. What would be the floor? The floor we are discussing now at in the international community is $20 per ton, and the cap is $50. And then the next point is to discuss about the slope of the corridor, that is the speed at which you increase this corridor of carbon prices. So there is now a steering committee launched both by the French government and Jim Kim at the World Bank on the corridor of prices, with members like Joe Stiglitz, Nick Stern, and myself to try to convince people that this is a better idea than to struggle for a unique worldwide carbon price. Now, and this will be my last point. It seems to me what we also have to do in order to convince, let's say, insurance companies, pension funds, that they should invest the money into green infrastructure, what we have to do is to change our view on the business as usual scenario. Because most people in the financial sphere still believe that, well, if we don't do anything, it's a bad story for poor people in Africa, but we, the rich people in northern countries, we won't suffer that much. So why should we bother? There are a number of exceptions, of course. People like Mark Carney, the governor of the central bank in England, and who is also the head of the Stability Board, Financial Stability Board. You probably know that Mark Carney had a huge speech, a very famous speech at the end of last year, saying the main threat on financial stability now is climate. So slowly the sphere of finance people is realizing how serious climate is, but we are still far away from a common sense of this matter within finance people. So my viewpoint is that what we have to do is to change our view on the business as usual scenario. One way to do this is to change the way, the kind of macroeconomic models we are using to assess forecasts on the future. And this is a very important moment because right now, as we are talking, there is a kind of earthquake launched by 3 economists in the US, namely Paul Romer, who is the new chief economist of the World Bank, Olivier Blanchard, who is the former chief economist of the IMF, and Narayana Kocherlakota, who is the former governor of Minneapolis Fed. Here there is a small mistake. This quotation is not from Blanchard, but from Kocherlakota, who says, we simply do not have a settled, successful theory of the macroeconomy. And we won't fix it by changing marginal details into our models, okay? And even more forcefully, Paul Romer is publishing a paper whose title is The Trouble with Macroeconomics, saying, in the last 3 decades, the methods and conclusions of macroeconomics have deteriorated to the point that much of the work in this area no longer qualifies as scientific research. Essentially, this echoes what Jeff just said about the primitive economic textbooks that we are teaching in the university. So Paul, Olivier, and Narayana are just saying something which seems to me to be obvious. We have to change the paradigm of macroeconomics to understand that the way we used to think about the business as usual scenario is entirely wrong. Things might look much uglier than we used to think. So I developed at the French Development Agency a new macroeconomic model trying to do this with climate change back loops. I don't have time to go into the details. You have the research paper here on the table. Let me just show you the outcome. The outcome is the following. If you look at the left bottom picture, the rate curve is the GDP, so you have an exponential growth of GDP, and this is the business as usual scenario without climate change, using the standard assumptions. So if there was no climate change on Earth, using standard assumptions, we still would have something like, most probably, an exponential growth of GDP. Now the left top picture is employment rate, the rate curve, and as you see, employment rate at the world level would stabilize very quickly around something like 75%, which is today's number. And inflation rate, the blue curve, would also stabilize at 2%, so that most central bankers would be very happy. Now, if you take into account climate change, things change dramatically. So I'm referring now to a deep Stern scenario. I don't have time to go into the details, but roughly speaking, if you take into account climate change, we may have forced degrowth by disaster by the end of this century. Now, if you look at the rate curve on the bottom left picture, the rate curve, this is GDP at the world level. So we will still have some growth up to the end of this century, but we may have a forced degrowth and a disaster at the turn of the century. Now, if you look at the top left picture, unemployment will explode. This is the employment rate, the blue curve, and inflation will be negative, meaning that we will have deflation. Now, this is a simulation. Of course, it's not a forecast, it's just a simulation. But it gives a rough idea about what might happen if we don't do anything. And the main message is that not only the poor will suffer, but also the rich, which is the reason why the rich should also behave today. And this is only under the assumption that the climate sensitivity will be around 3. So let me just end with one word on this parameter. Climate sensitivity is a way to capture how much temperature, average temperature on Earth will increase due to the doubling of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Nowadays, climatologists have no idea about how high or low this climate sensitivity is. It might be something like 1.5, which is the lowest value. It might be also 6, which is the highest reasonable value. So this simulation is run with the assumption that it is around 3, which is in a sense the average value that climatologists use to adopt for their simulations. Now if you make the assumption that climate sensitivity is around 6, which is possible, then we may have a forced degrowth by 2050. Not at the end of this century, but in 2 decades, okay? 3 decades. And we will have a disaster. Some of us in this room will be able to live this disaster. So, again, I'm not claiming that this is a forecast. I'm just saying that if we had these kind of business as usual scenarios in mind, then we would probably consider that a number of investments are profitable because they allow us to avoid a disaster. Nowadays, a lot of people in the financial sphere are still thinking, oh, an investment that does not have a return, something like 10% a year, is not interesting. But if we change our mind on the business as usual scenario, then this changes entirely what a profitable investment means. Now, last point, which is more optimistic in a sense, is the following. There are ways, of course, to avoid this disaster. One way is to have a carbon price. And I already mentioned the fact that the French government now is struggling for something like the corridor of prices. Now the question is, what kind of prices? I'm just stopping. Yeah. Yeah, sure. This is my last slide. One way, the question we could raise is, what should be the level of the carbon price in order to provide the right incentives, in order to change to shift from the carbon-based economy we have today towards a low-carbon economy. And here are the figures I get using the simulation that I just showed you. And depending upon the sensitivity of climate, we get different results. So look at the columns on the right, under the assumption that the climate sensitivity is 2.9, let's say 3, which, as I said, is the average climate sensitivity that climatologists used to consider. Then you may need something like a price of the ton of CO2 around $260, maybe $300 by 2050, by 2020, in 3 years. If we want to have the objective of 1.5 degrees of an increase of the average temperature at the end of the century to be put into practice. So let me reformulate it. You remember that at the Paris Agreement last year, the international community decided we should do our best to reduce the increase of the average temperature at the end of the century below plus 2 degrees. And we even said we will do our best in order to be as close as possible to plus 1.5 degrees. Now, what this picture tells you is that if we want this, if we are serious, then we should have a price of the ton of CO2 around 250, 60, maybe $300 the ton by 2020. We are very far away from it, and the question that we can raise again is, are we serious when you claim we want to fight against climate change, that is, against poverty? Let me just one sentence finish by this. If you just put together all the nationally determined contributions that the countries have given to the COP21 and that are going to be discussed in 2 weeks now in Marrakesh by COP22, you put together all these indices, nationally determined contributions, and you make the heroic assumption that every country will keep its promise, will really do what it promised to do last year. Then, according to climatologists, what we should have at the end of this century is an increase of the temperature by 3.5 degrees. This will be way above the 2 degrees threshold on which the international community agreed to coordinate, okay? So in a sense, the international community is saying now, we have to fight against climate change, but we did not so far take it seriously so that to put into practice the promise we made last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Now,